Hey guys, tonight we will not step straight into the mist-covered scaffold of the Tower of London, as we usually do. Instead, let us begin the journey right from a splendid French palace, where a 12-year-old English girl was trembling as she passed through the enormous gates. None of the servants present that day could have guessed that this small young girl would become the center of one of the most legendary tragedies in England. Anne Boleyn, a name that evoked both beauty and danger. People whispered that she had an extra finger, eyes as sharp as blades, and a smile powerful enough to bring an entire court to its knees. But behind those murmurs lay a series of strange truths, shocking, and even more terrifying than anything you have ever heard. So, prepare yourself, because tonight we will uncover 102 bizarre and chilling facts about Anne Boleyn, the woman who dared to challenge the throne and ultimately paid the price with her very own head. Trust me, you will not sleep easily if you think this is just a romantic fairy tale. And as always, before we begin, hit like and subscribe, but only if you truly want to join these journeys into the darkness of history. Do not forget to leave a comment to tell me where you are listening from and what time it is where you live. Now then, dim the lights. Rest your head on the pillow and let your breath slow down. Let us gently step into the Tudor corridors of memory, where Anne Boleyn is still waiting for us at the end of the path. Fact 1: France was the place that nurtured her childhood. Anne Boleyn, the woman who would later become one of the most famous queens in the history of England, did not actually grow up in the damp, misty land of England with its heavy wooden castles. The most important years of her youth took place in France, where the dazzling light of the Valois court touched everything from clothing and etiquette to the very art of living. Just imagine, while English nobles in the 16th century were still confined to the greyish landscape of sheep fields and endless drizzle, across the Channel the French palaces were alive with music, dancing, and philosophical debates. So it is no surprise that a Tudor girl sent there absorbed all the refinement of Europe, and upon her return became a phenomenon that stunned all of England. It was her father, Thomas Boleyn, a shrewd diplomat who sent Anne to France, knowing that his family's future depended on his daughter gaining the sophistication that set her apart from the countless other noble women of England. And indeed, Anne did exactly that. In France she learned French so well that she spoke it like a native. While many English ladies still stumbled through a few Latin phrases, this bilingual skill became one of her greatest advantages later, making her appear elegant and alluring in the eyes of Henry VIII, who was already weary of the stiff mannerisms of his court. But Anne did not stop at language. She mastered singing, the lute, Italian dance, and the courtly manners of Valois society, all of which transformed her into something unusual among English women. When she returned to London, she did not appear in dark Tudor gowns covering every inch of skin. Instead, she wore low-cut French dresses with flowing lace sleeves. The height of fashion. Picture it among rows of nearly identical women. Suddenly there appeared a graceful figure, with bright black eyes, a soft French accent, and quick, lively steps. Henry VIII saw her, and suddenly the entire kingdom was plunged into a religious crisis because of that difference. People like to say politics is a man's game, but Anne understood early that real power could reside in a smile, in a gaze, in a woman's subtle intelligence. In France she had served Queen Claude, known for her piety and learning, and she witnessed how powerful ladies used words to shape the fate of men. That environment gave Anne the sharpness that later earned her the nickname, the nine-tailed fox. Some scholars even suspect that during her time in France, Anne first encountered the Reformation ideas spreading across Europe. She never openly declared support, but the seeds were planted, making her more willing to back England's break from the Pope. And we all know what happened next. Henry VIII split from Rome and created the Church of England just to marry her. In other words, part of the reason for England's greatest religious crisis began with Anne's girlhood in France. Yet that very difference became a double-edged sword. The English nobles saw French style as foreign, even suspicious. A woman who was both beautiful and clever, who dressed differently, who spoke sharply, was nothing but a thorn in the side of a society that demanded female obedience. Whispers spread. Anne had an extra finger. She was a witch. She had bewitched Henry. In truth, it was simply the backlash against the difference France had given her. Do you see? That seemingly small detail, being educated in France, decided her fate. Had she not gone, she might never have been queen, and England might never have broken with Rome. Yet without France, she might also have escaped the blade. One chilling detail: when Anne had to leave France for England, she was not happy. She had grown used to art, elegance, and freedom. To her, England was cold, bleak, with heavy rituals and men of lesser refinement. A historian once imagined her whispering as she landed at Dover, "Farewell, splendid France. Farewell, youth. Hello, destiny." And from that moment, Anne walked the path toward both the throne and the scaffold. So when recounting the first truth about Anne Boleyn, we cannot ignore her time in France. It was France that made her graceful, intelligent, dangerous. And it was because of those very qualities she was labelled cunning and deceitful. A girl who left a land of elegance to become England's queen, but also the victim of merciless plots. Look closely, and you will see all her glory and all her tragedy began there. Fact 2: Anne Boleyn was not a flawless beauty, but it was precisely those imperfections that made her unforgettable, you know. When people imagine a queen, they usually picture flawless beauty, porcelain skin, long golden hair, crimson lips, and a body moving with the grace of a living Greek statue. But Anne Boleyn did not quite fit that mold. In fact, to many of her contemporaries, she was strangely plain. And yet, it was that very strange plainness that made Henry VIII fall so hard he split from the Pope and shook all of Europe. Contemporary records describe Anne as petite, with a darker complexion than the pale skin prized by English nobility. Her eyes were black, bright, and said to burn through anyone they met. A Venetian diplomat wrote that her eyes had a power that no one could escape, even with a glance. Others said her eyes laughed before her lips could, and spoke what the mouth dared not say. With a single look, she made Henry VIII, a giant of a man with an ego even bigger, tremble. The most controversial detail was her supposed extra finger. Rumours claimed Anne had 6 fingers on one hand, along with a prominent mole on her neck. Today, these would be minor features. But in the 16th century, anything unusual was branded as demonic or witch-like. After her execution, her enemies used those claims to smear her reputation, saying she was not human, but the devil's instrument. Many modern historians dismiss the 6-finger story as propaganda. Yet the uncertainty only deepens the mystery around her. Anne also did not have the golden hair adored in England. She had dark hair and a deeper complexion, which made her stand out not as an angel of light, but as a mysterious figure in candlelight. Henry, tired of conventional beauties, was drawn to that uniqueness. There is one interesting note. Anne was often described as not beautiful, but charming. It sounds like faint praise, but in truth it was accurate. Her allure was not in her face, but in how she moved, how she spoke, how her eyes lingered on others. Imagine a feast filled with the sound of lutes and the scent of wine, dozens of blonde noblewomen in white gowns, and then Anne walks in a darker dress, with sharp eyes and a clear, distinctive voice. Instantly, no one could look away. What is worth noting is that Anne herself was acutely aware of both her flaws and her advantages. She knew she was not the most beautiful flower, so she chose to be the most unforgettable one. She used her intelligence, her charm, and even her slightly sharp tongue to make others both fear and adore her. Men were conquered. Women were cautious. and enemies hated her so much they invented stories. But all of these combined created an Anne Boleyn that history could never forget. That is why, when Henry VIII fell in love with her, people gossiped endlessly. Why would a king abandon a queen like Catherine of Aragon, noble, virtuous, the daughter of Spanish royalty, to chase after a woman who was not conventionally beautiful, with rumours of deformity? The answer is simple, because Anne did not need beauty to be the centre, she only needed to be herself. A mixture of allure, dangya, and uniqueness. And that very thing, ironically, was what lifted her from a minor noblewoman to Queen of England. But as you can see, those same differences made her an easy target when she fell from grace. People wasted no time in picking apart every detail, from fingernails to moles. To build the story of the demonic queen, once you are hated, every difference becomes evidence against you, and Anne Boleyn remains the clearest proof of the cruelty of medieval public opinion. Fact 3. Anne Boleyn never accepted being a mistress, and that refusal changed the history of England. Picture this: you are a young, intelligent, charming woman serving at court. Suddenly, the eyes of the most powerful king in Europe at the time, Henry VIII, fall upon you. For many, that would be the golden chance to become the chosen one who shares the king's bed at night, who receives jewels, estates, and a retinue of servants by day. In an age when male power overshadowed everything, being the king's mistress was already a pathway to wealth and influence. But Anne Boleyn chose differently. She refused. And not just once. Henry pursued her with passion, sent her love letters, showered her with gifts. Yet Anne rejected him. She knew very well that once she stepped into the role of mistress, the path upward would close, and she would end up just another footnote in the long list of the king's affairs. The love letters Henry VIII sent to Anne still survive today, and they are truly astonishing. Henry, a man used to commanding armies, executing rivals, and conquering women effortlessly, turned into a love-struck suitor, writing trembling words. He called Anne the love of my life, the only woman who can subdue my heart. In one letter, he even complained, "Why do you make me wait? Why do you treat me so coldly?" It almost reads like a young man whining after being ignored by his crush on Instagram. But it was precisely this coldness that made Anne stand out. She knew her worth, and she wanted more than fleeting nights. She wanted a crown, a throne, a position equal to Henry. It is said that Anne once declared, "I will not give myself to any man unless he is my husband." Today that may sound ordinary, but in the 16th century it was a shocking challenge, especially since the man she was rejecting was the king. The more Henry was denied, the more he burned with desire, and this spiral of passion drove him to a daring decision to divorce Catherine of Aragon, his legitimate wife, and a Spanish princess, in order to marry Anne Boleyn. You see, it was not merely that Henry grew tired of his wife, but that Anne forced him to choose everything or nothing. The problem was, to divorce Catherine, Henry needed the Pope's approval, and the Pope, unwilling to offend Spain, the Catholic superpower, firmly refused. So Henry did the unthinkable: he severed England from the Roman Church, declared himself the head of the Church of England, and thereby legalized his marriage to Anne. In other words, the refusal of one woman helped set off tremors across all of Europe. A vast religious reformation was unleashed, paving the way for England to become a nation independent of Rome. And it all began with a single firm no. What is interesting is that Anne's refusal was not just political strategy, but also a clever way to capture Henry's heart. A king who was used to everyone obeying him suddenly faced a woman who resisted, and he became even more obsessed. It is like being accustomed to easy games and then stumbling upon an unexpected hard mode. You cannot resist the challenge. Anne was Henry's hardest game, and as you know, it was also this defiance that made Anne the target of the entire court. The nobility hated her for humiliating Catherine, the Spanish princess. The church raged. Since she was the reason Henry broke with Rome, the common people gossiped. Since they adored Catherine's gentle nature, all the blows of public opinion landed on Anne. But if Anne had not refused, if she had agreed to be Henry's mistress, the history would have taken another path. There would have been no Church of England, no Reformation, no Tudor dramas of glory and tragedy. This third fact reminds us of one truth. Sometimes a single firm no has the power to change destiny. And in Anne Boleyn's case, it changed not only her own fate, but that of an entire kingdom. Fact 4: Anne Boleyn was not a stunning beauty, but her intelligence and charisma were her deadly weapons. If you have heard someone say that Anne Boleyn was a breathtaking beauty, then I am sorry to disappoint you. She was not described that way in historical records. In fact, contemporary accounts of Anne are rather conflicting. Some praised her as pretty and charming, while others wrote that she was not beautiful in the traditional sense. So why, then, did Henry VIII fall so completely that he broke the church itself just to marry her? This is exactly where Anne's mysterious appeal lay. She did not win with her face. She won with her presence. Some records describe her as having a slightly darker complexion, sleek black hair, sharp black eyes that could speak, and a smile bright enough to light up a room. People said that when Anne looked at someone, they felt as if they were the most important person in the world. Put simply, she was like a medieval influencer. No filters, no Photoshop, just gaze and aura, and people could not look away. Modern scholars believe Anne had remarkable communication skills. Fluent in French and trained for years in the French court, she carried herself with elegance and sophistication, completely unlike most English women of her time. Imagine a court full of dull nobles, used to obedience, and then suddenly a woman appeared sharp, witty, moving with Parisian chic. It is no wonder Henry VIII was captivated. And here is the key. Anne knew how to play the psychology game. She may not have been dazzling enough for everyone to swoon, but she knew how to make herself unforgettable. A tilt of the head at the right moment, a half-joking remark, a gaze held 1 second longer. These were enough to carve her image into Henry's memory. In a court where women were expected to be gentle and submissive, Anne dared to argue, dared to challenge, dared to provoke the king with her sharp wit. And as you know, sometimes stubbornness is the most seductive thing of all. Another curious detail: some of Anne's enemies spread rumors that she had deformities like an extra finger or a large mole on her neck. Historians still debate whether these were true or merely slanders. But even if they were true, they did nothing to diminish her allure. In fact, perhaps those very imperfections made Anne unique and unforgettable in Henry's eyes. Just as today, some people may not fit conventional beauty standards, yet radiate a distinctive charm. The irony is that because Anne was not extraordinarily beautiful, her enemies found it easier to attack her. They sneered. She has nothing special except a sharp tongue and cunning tricks. Or Henry was so blinded that he abandoned a gentle wife for a woman not even beautiful. Such gossip only made Anne one of the most controversial figures in history. But think about it. If Anne had been just another pretty face, would she have had the power to move history? At court, beauty fades quickly. But intelligence and the ability to captivate through wit are what people remember. Anne understood that, and she turned herself into a legend, not because of her face, but because of the way she made a king change the fate of an entire nation. Some modern historians even suggest that Anne was an early symbol of feminism. She proved that a woman did not need flawless beauty to hold power. She could rely on intellect, confidence, and the skill to control the game. You may not agree, but it is undeniable that Anne Boleyn lived differently from the standards of her time. So, this fourth fact reminds you sometimes you do not need to be the most beautiful person in the room, you only need to be the one no one can forget. And Anne Boleyn with her sharp eyes and clever tongue, did exactly that enough to change the whole of England. Fact 5. Anne Boleyn, the 12-year-old girl sent to France, where she learned how to survive in a world full of traps. If you are 12 years old today, you are probably hugging a doll, playing games on your phone, or arguing with your parents about going to bed early. But in the 16th century, for Anne Boleyn, being 12 meant leaving her family behind, crossing the stormy English Channel, and stepping into a world where every glance and every whisper could decide your future. Yes, at only 12 years old, Anne was sent to France to serve Queen Claude, the wife of King Francis I. It might sound glamorous, but in reality it was like being thrown into a harsh school, one where no textbooks were written, and the only test was surviving at court. Why France? Because at that time, the French court was considered the centre of culture, fashion, and intrigue. Women there did not just learn to read and write, they learned to dance, to play music, to converse with grace, and most importantly, to become survival artists in a pack of wolves dressed in velvet. Anne quickly absorbed this environment. She mastered French so thoroughly that later she was more fluent in it than in her own tongue. She learned to dance, to play the lute, to write love letters with words sweet enough to melt any man's heart. And if you think, well, every noble girl learned that. The truth is, not everyone could use those skills as weapons to climb all the way to the throne. The most important lesson Anne learned in France was not music or dance, but the art of concealment. At the court of Francis I, gossip, affairs, and power games happened daily. Women there were both victims and tools. They were painted, dressed in silks, but in truth treated as ornaments for banquets. A misplaced glance or an ill-timed word could turn you into a laughingstock or worse, a sacrificial pawn. Anne saw it all, and she learned to survive. You must know when to stay silent, when to smile, and when to speak. You must learn to turn wit and charm into armor. Some historians argue that this time in France shaped the sharp version of Anne Boleyn that Henry VIII later adored, because in France, Anne did not just learn how to dance gracefully, she learned how to dance with shadows of power. She learned how to stand in a room full of enemies and still make them admire her. Another fascinating detail in France, Anne was exposed to the new ideas of the Renaissance about art, philosophy, and even religion. These ideas deeply influenced her views when she returned to England, transforming her from a provincial girl into a woman with an open, modern mind. But do not think life there was all glamour. Imagine being a 12-year-old girl, far from family, in a foreign land, among strangers speaking another language, walking every day as if on a tightrope. One small mistake could exile you forever. The price of early maturity was exactly that. And perhaps it was this harsh school that made Anne grow up far faster than her years. When she returned to England, she was no longer a naive girl, but a woman with European poise, confidence, and an arsenal of subtle weapons ready for the battles of love and politics to come. Without those years in France, Anne might have remained a middling noblewoman, forgotten by history, but because she graduated from that brutal school, she entered the English court like a fresh gust of wind, different, unique, and dangerous. So, this fifth fact is not just a minor detail in her biography. It was the doorway to Anne Boleyn's destiny, because at 12 years old, while other children were still playing in fields, Anne learned the greatest lesson of her life to survive and rise in a ruthless world. You need more than beauty. You need subtlety, quick wit, and eyes that see everything. Fact 6. Anne Boleyn, the woman who was not beautiful by the standards of her time, but still captivated King Henry VIII. If you flip through a fashion magazine today, you might see V-line faces, porcelain skin, and ideal height. The 16th century was no different. They had their own beauty standards: golden hair, rosy white skin, clear blue eyes, and a slightly fuller figure to prove that the family had plenty to eat. But Anne Boleyn was different. So different that if you placed her among the pageant queens of her time, she might have scored low right from the start. First, Anne had glossy black hair instead of shimmering blonde. Her eyes were not dreamy sapphire blue, but dark brown, sharp and piercing, making people feel both scrutinized and mesmerized. Her skin was darker than the prized porcelain white, and her figure was described as slender, not the plump, prosperous look admired back then. At first glance, you might think, then how did she catch the eye of Henry VIII, one of Europe's most notorious womanizers? But here lies the intrigue. Anne Boleyn did not need to be beautiful in a universally accepted sense. She had a stronger weapon difference. In a court where 10 out of 10 ladies had blonde hair, 8 had powder white skin, and 7 had blue eyes. Stepping in with raven black hair, burning brown eyes, and a sharp aura was like bringing an abstract painting into an exhibition of classical portraits. You could love it or hate it, but you could not ignore it. Henry VIII, so used to cookie-cutter beauty, was suddenly struck by this contrast. People said Anne's eyes had an odd power. They were not shy or demure, but eyes that knew what they wanted and how to make others give it. And trust me, in a court where women were trained to be meek, a girl daring to look straight at you, even with a hint of challenge, was the spice that drove powerful men insane. Not only that, Anne was extremely clever in how she used her looks. Instead of trying to fit in with the beauty standard, she turned her differences into her brand. Her black hair was always sleek, her brown eyes highlighted with subtle makeup, her darker complexion presented as proof of health and vitality, a refreshing image among pale nobles. Some rumors, likely invented by enemies, even claimed Anne had 6 fingers on one hand and a mole on her neck. In those days, such things could be branded signs of the devil. But think about it, if true, instead of diminishing her allure, they only added to her aura of mystery. And for a man like Henry, who spent his life chasing novelty, that was the most irresistible bait of all. Anne's beauty was not in her figure, but in how she made people feel, like a piece of jazz music, not perfect in the classical sense, but haunting, unforgettable. Moreover, Anne knew not only how to stand out, but how to conceal herself when needed. She would not flaunt herself upon entering the palace. She waited for the right moment to shine. At a banquet, while all eyes were on blonde ladies dancing, Anne could stand still, and yet one glance at Henry, a tilt of the head, or a faint smile was enough to leave the king sleepless. And here lies what other women lacked. Anne did not beg for love. She made it addictive. Henry did not see her as a beauty to possess, but as a mystery to unravel. And for a king used to everything being handed to him, the chase for Anne was the ultimate thrill. The result, a woman who did not meet her era's beauty standards became the one who changed the course of English history. What seemed like a flaw turned out to be her greatest strength. So if today you look in the mirror and feel you do not match Instagram or TikTok ideals, remember Anne Boleyn, because perhaps your difference is the story no one else can tell. Anne proved it, and the price she paid, we will uncover in later truths. Fact 7. Anne Boleyn, the woman who dared to refuse being the king's mistress. In a court where women were often treated like walking ornaments for powerful men, Anne Boleyn did the unthinkable. She said no to Henry VIII. Imagine it, the most powerful king in Europe at the time. A man who could make noble families tremble with a snap of his fingers. A man used to taking what he wanted, suddenly being faced with a young woman who stood tall, looked him in the eye, and refused. For Henry, the shock was like a max-level gamer being rejected by an NPC, refusing a quest. At first, Henry thought of Anne as mere entertainment. He had had dozens of mistresses before noble women. Maids. All sorts. For him, it was as easy as choosing from a menu, just point. And it was his. He assumed Anne would be the same. But no, Anne Boleyn was different. She did not smile shyly, nor did she shed grateful tears when noticed by the king. Instead, Anne calmly replied, "I do not want to be your mistress. If anything, I want to be your wife." Your queen? It sounds bold, but it was in fact a shrewd strategy. Anne understood the fate of the women before her. Royal mistresses were pampered for a while, then discarded. Some were married off to lesser nobles. Others vanished from court as if they had never existed. That was not the future Anne wanted. And you know what? It was that very no that drove Henry mad. He was used to obedience. So when he met resistance, it became a new game. How to conquer the woman who refused to submit. Henry began writing letters to Anne, passionate love letters that still survive today. In them, he called her the only mistress of my heart. Sweet words. Though at the time he was still married to Queen Catherine of Aragon. In one letter, Henry even sent a little heart-shaped brooch. More like a clumsy young suitor than a powerful king. And Anne. She read those letters but never rushed to respond. Sometimes she kept Henry waiting for weeks, even months, as if she wanted to teach the king a lesson in patience. And it was precisely that distance that made Henry more and more addicted. You could say Anne did not simply refuse to be a mistress. She turned that refusal into a weapon. It flipped Henry from hunter to prey, pulled along by her hand. And when a man as powerful as Henry became addicted to the chase, there was only one outcome he had to give her, what no one else had ever received: a promise of marriage. Of course, to make that promise real, Henry had to do the unthinkable divorce. Catherine, his wife of more than 20 years, that decision would spark a religious crisis, tear England away from the Catholic Church, and even lead to bloodshed. But it all began with one thing. Anne said no. This may be one of history's greatest lessons. Sometimes power lies not in saying yes, but in daring to say no. Anne Boleyn proved that one refusal at the right time could change the destiny of an entire nation. And if tonight you feel too small in this world, remember once, a young woman said no to the most powerful king in Europe, and that very act rewrote history. Fact 8. Anne Boleyn was once branded a witch simply because of her unusual appearance. You see, in the Middle Ages and the Renaissance, anything unusual about a woman's body could be branded as the mark of the devil. Today, a beauty mole near your lips might be called alluring. But in the 16th century, it could have earned you the label Satan's mark. And Anne Boleyn was not spared. Many accounts from political enemies claimed Anne had a prominent mole near her mouth, and perhaps even an extra finger on her left hand. Now imagine a woman entering the Tudor court, elegant and intelligent, but with a few unusual features. Immediately, her enemies had an excuse to whisper, "Those are the signs of a witch. One who has made a pact with the devil." Of course, these rumours were often deliberately exaggerated. Anne was not just any lady at court. She was the woman who shook the throne of England, who made the king defy the Pope. For political foes, the easiest way to destroy her was to brand her as the embodiment of dark magic. Do you see? It was a classic political trick when you cannot defeat a woman with reason. Smear her with the fears the public already holds. At that time, hysteria over witchcraft was so intense that even a rumour could lead to inquisitorial courts or the stake. One anecdote says that when Anne appeared in public, some whispered about her strange black eyes. Those eyes were described as glowing, almost hypnotic. Instead of being admired as alluring, many found them frightening, nicknaming her the Black Raven of the Tudor court. Beauty was dangerous, but difference could be deadly. And yet, here's the irony. Those very accusations of witchcraft only made Anne stand out more. In a court filled with similar faces, she became unforgettable, and Henry VIII, instead of being frightened, was drawn in by that mystery. Perhaps he saw in Anne a power others lacked, the power of difference. But tragedy lurked within. Those charges of sorcery would never leave her. When Anne was brought to trial in the year 1536, many enemies revived these devil's marks as proof that she was not only guilty of treason against the king, but of betrayal against God. And so, once again, we see how the old world worked. A mole, an Ixtofinger, or a pair of dark eyes could brand you a witch. No evidence was needed, only the fear of the crowd. So if tonight you look in the mirror and notice a small scar, a strange mole, or any unusual feature, remember, centuries ago, it could have cost you your life. But for Anne Boleyn, those very oddities turned her into a legend, a figure whose story, 500 years later, is still told by candlelight to lull listeners into uneasy dreams. Fact 9. Anne Boleyn never became a secret mistress. What made Anne Boleyn stand out in the Tudor court was not only her looks or intelligence, but the way she drew boundaries for herself. While many women at court were willing to become Henry VIII's shadow lovers in exchange for status and lavish gifts, Anne flatly refused. Here's a striking fact at first. Henry only wanted Anne as a mistress. Just as her sister Mary Boleyn had once been the king's official lover, but Anne would not accept. She turned him down again and again, leaving Henry in the state we might today call crushed, but rejected. Picture this, Henry, the most powerful king in Europe at the time, writing desperate love letters to Anne, calling her the love of my heart. He even sent costly gifts, jewels, rare fabrics, even diamonds engraved with their initials. And Anne, she gently but firmly refused to accept them. You see, in today's terms, Anne would probably be called the Queen of Ghosting, a master of ignoring, but it was exactly this refusal to be easy that turned her from just another woman into Henry's obsession. Many historians believe that refusing to sleep with the king without a title was Anne's shrewdest strategy. It challenged Henry, who was used to getting anything he wanted. And when powerful men are challenged, they only crave more. The result? As you know, Henry was not only infatuated, he was determined to marry Anne at any cost, even if it meant tearing apart his marriage to Catherine of Aragon, defying the Pope, and ultimately sparking one of the greatest schisms in European history. All because one woman dared to say no. I will not be your mistress, either queen or nothing. And so people say Anne Boleyn was not just a beautiful woman, she was the first to teach Henry VIII that love had to come with respect. And it was this very firmness that lifted her from an unknown gentlewoman to Queen of England, even if the path was soaked with blood and tears. Fact 10. Anne Boleyn, the woman who made Henry VIII cut ties with the Pope. Can you imagine it? One woman, simply by refusing to lie beside the king, shook all of Europe. If Fact 9 showed us that Anne never accepted being a secret mistress, Fact 10 reveals the consequence. Henry VIII, the king famous for his bulging belly and massive ego, dared to do the unprecedented, declare war on the Vatican itself. Let's rewind. At that time, Henry was married to Catherine of Aragon, a powerful Spanish princess who had once been the wife of Henry's brother, Arthur. From the beginning, the marriage carried whispers of scandal, but Henry needed Catherine to cement England's alliance with Spain. Things might have worked if Catherine had produced a son, but after many failed pregnancies, Henry had only one daughter, Mary. Obsessed with securing a male heir, Henry began to see Catherine as a burden. And then Anne Boleyn appeared, young, clever, enchanting, and most of all, unwilling to yield. Henry was so smitten, he wrote dozens of love letters, swearing he would do anything to have her. Anne's unyielding refusals only fanned the flames. So Henry appealed to Pope Clement VII, demanding his marriage to Catherine be annulled so he could wed Anne. But the Pope, afraid of angering Spain, Catherine's nephew was none other than Emperor Charles V, flatly refused. If you think Henry would give up, then you do not know him. This was a king famous for stubbornness. Once he wanted something, nothing on earth could stop him. When the Pope said no, Henry decided, then I will not need the Pope at all. And that was the turning point. To marry Anne Boleyn, Henry severed England from Rome, created the Church of England, and crowned himself supreme head of the Church. In other words, he granted himself his own divorce. Do you see? One personal decision to marry Anne ignited a religious revolution. Monasteries were dissolved, church land seized, thousands of monks executed or exiled. An entire kingdom was transformed by a love affair. People like to joke that Anne Boleyn was the only woman in history who made a king block the Vatican. If social media had existed, Henry's status might have read, relationship status. It's complicated. Blocked Pope Clement VII. Of course, every choice has a price. Anne Boleyn got her crown, but she also awakened countless enemies inside and outside the court. Because for one woman to ascend the throne, blood had to be spilled, and the Tudor dynasty was changed forever. Fact 11. When she became queen, Anne Boleyn turned the court into a battlefield of silk. When the crown was placed on Anne's head in the year 1533, England had just witnessed an unprecedented shock. King Henry VIII had defied the Pope to marry her. People expected that, with such passionate love, Anne would live out a fairy tale reign. But the reality was a tragicomedy, with the court as the main stage, where every step she took was scrutinized, and every word she spoke became ammunition for her enemies. Anne, once the charming French-bred lady, it was now Queen of England, but she was never the Queen of the people. From the moment Catherine of Aragon was cast aside, the public saw Anne as a husband-stealer, a witch who bewitched the king. Londoners even called her openly the concubine. Imagine riding through the streets on the day of your coronation, and instead of cheers, hearing murmurs of contempt. That was the atmosphere Anne endured. The people would not forgive her for replacing Catherine, a Spanish princess, who had been Henry's wife for over 20 years. Yet Anne did not shrink. On the contrary, she wielded her intelligence and sharpness to assert power. She supported religious reform, sponsored progressive scholars, and even intervened in politics. This made the conservative faction in court hate her even more. One of the biggest scandals was her attitude toward Catherine and Princess Mary. Anne repeatedly mocked Catherine as the old Spanish woman, and Mary was demoted to lady, stripped of her princess title. This poured oil onto the fire. The public already hated Anne, and now they saw her as the evil queen. But Anne's enemies were not only outside the court. Inside, she faced rivalries as nobles lost influence with her rise. Political alliances once centered on Catherine and Spain were overturned, and in a court of intrigue, anyone could turn into a dagger at your back. The cruel irony was that, even as queen, Anne still had not given Henry what he wanted, most a son. Their first child, Elizabeth, born in 1533, brought not joy but Henry's disappointment. Her later pregnancies ended in tragedy, miscarriages, or stillbirths. With each loss, her position weakened. One detail is telling. Some records claim Anne once snapped at Henry when he showed his disappointment. "If you could love our daughter as your father once loved Princess Margaret, then we would not have to worry so much." This shows Anne was no meek consort, but a woman bold enough to confront her husband, the very king who could order any head to fall. Her frankness was what made Henry both enthralled and enraged. In the end, that frankness, combined with her failure to produce a male heir, fueled the fire of her downfall. As Henry's passion for dead, his eyes turned to Jane Seymour, gentler, less stormy. And Anne, once the woman who shook the Vatican, was pushed aside, until just a few years later, She was led to the scaffold. People often say Anne Boleyn entered history as the woman who changed a kingdom, but left it as a victim of the very power game she once won. Fact 12. From Queen of England to condemned prisoner, at the scaffold in European history. Few tragedies were as swift and fierce as Anne Boleyn's fate. In just 3 short years after her coronation, she fell from powerful queen to traitor. It all began in 1536, a fateful year. First, Henry VIII suffered a devastating fall from his horse during a tournament. Injuries so grave that people thought he might die. Anne, then pregnant, was said to have been thrown into despair when she heard the news. Days later, she miscarried, and the child was a boy. For Henry, this was nothing less than a sign from God that heaven would not give him a legitimate heir through Anne. At that very moment, her enemies in court were ready. Thomas Cromwell, once Anne's ally, turned against her when their political interests clashed. He knew that for his survival, Anne had to go, and so a plot was woven. Anne was accused of adultery with several men, including musician Mark Smeaton, courtier Henry Norris, and even her own brother, George Boleyn. Does it sound absurd? A queen constantly watched by hundreds of eyes, supposedly carrying on affairs with multiple men. But in the 16th century, with a king's will absolute, logic mattered less than convenient justification. The trial played out like a scripted drama. The evidence was flimsy, confessions coerced, even dates and places contradicted. But none of it mattered. The only goal was to strip Anne of her crown and clear the path for Henry to wed Jane Seymour. It is said that when Anne heard the death sentence, she did not wail, as many women might. Instead, she kept her pride. If it is God's will, I am ready to accept it. On May 19th, 1536, at the Tower of London, Anne mounted the scaffold. She wore a grey gown, a black cloak, and knelt before a French swordsman brought specially because he was known for swift, clean executions. In her final words, Anne did not curse Henry. She prayed for him, hoping he would live long to rule over England. And then, with one swift stroke, the woman who had shaken Europe was gone. Her death shocked the world, though not all mourned. To many, it was justice for a woman they saw as a usurper. But to history, it became a symbol of the ruthless cruelty of power. Just 11 days later, Henry married Jane Seymour. The speed of it led many later historians to argue that everything had been nothing more than a staged play for Henry to exchange wives. And yet, Anne Boleyn did not leave this world in vain. Her daughter, Elizabeth, would grow to become Queen Elizabeth I, the greatest queen in the history of England. Anne's death was thus a paradox. Henry had wanted to wipe out the Boleyn bloodline, but it was that very blood that left the brightest mark. Today, visitors to the Tower of London still whisper that, on misty nights, the figure of a woman in a grey cloak, headless, drifts across the cold stone yard. They believe it is Anne, the tragic queen, lingering within the veil of history, soaked in blood and tears. Fact 13. The legacy after death, from tragic ghost to immortal symbol. Imagine this. A woman once celebrated, crowned, seated upon the throne, but within a few years disgraced as a lustful witch, and finally beheaded on a cold scaffold. If the story ended there, Anne Boleyn might have remained only a cursed name in Tudor chronicles. But history is full of paradoxes. What Henry VIII tried so hard to erase the Boleyn line became the seed that forever changed England's destiny. Anne died, but her daughter lived. Elizabeth, only 2 years old when her mother was executed, grew up under suspicion, her legitimacy often questioned, her life at risk more than once. And yet, almost miraculously, she survived. She later claimed the throne and became Elizabeth I, the longest reigning and greatest monarch of the Tudor dynasty. What is striking is that Elizabeth rarely mentioned her mother. In official documents, the name Anne Boleyn was absent, as if a wound too deep to expose. Yet Elizabeth never forgot. She wore a special ring, inside which were two tiny portraits, one of herself, the other of Anne. It was her secret way of keeping her mother close. Even when the world had branded Anne a traitor, historians call it the sweetest revenge. Henry VIII, with 6 wives, longed for a son to inherit his crown, but fate was cruel to him. It was Elizabeth, the daughter he once dismissed, who left the golden legacy. Under her reign, England transformed from a modest kingdom into a powerful empire, beginning the glorious Elizabethan age. So Anne's legacy did not lie in the crown she once wore, but in the daughter she left behind. Her unjust death became the hidden flame that fueled Elizabeth's strength, enabling her to rule with unmatched resolve and brilliance. Beyond Elizabeth, Anne's legacy lived on in culture. After her execution, she became the subject of countless tales. Some painted her as a witch, a seductress who ensnared the king with spells. Others saw her as a martyr of the Reformation, the queen who helped bring the English Bible into the hands of common people, shaking the Pope's power. In later centuries, even Shakespeare mentioned Anne not as a sorceress, but as the link leading to Elizabeth's birth. Slowly, her image shifted, from a disgraced queen to a tragic emblem of injustice. Modern historians now look at Anne with greater fairness. They see not only a woman who challenged the norms of her age, but also one who set in motion political and religious upheavals that reshaped Europe. Without Anne, there might not have been a Church of England, nor an Elizabeth I, nor the empire on which the sun never sets. Of course, Anne was not perfect. She was proud. She made enemies, and she played her role in breaking Henry's first marriage. But that is what makes her real, a flesh and blood woman, not the angel or demon her contemporaries claimed. Even in modern popular culture, Anne Boleyn continues to inspire. From the other Boleyn girl to Anne of the Thousand Days, she appears as a complex figure, alluring, intelligent, yet tragically human. And so, in public memory, Anne is no longer just the second wife executed by Henry VIII. She is a symbol of a woman who dared to challenge a man's world, who demanded to be loved and respected, and who left behind a legacy no one can erase. You see, fate took everything from Anne, her honor, her power, her life. But history gave her something greater: immortality in human memory. And perhaps, on long nights in the Tower of London, her headless ghost still wanders not to curse, but to whisper to the future, "I lost everything, but my daughter triumphed." Fact 14. Anne Boleyn's head. The tragedy and mystery after the scaffold. When people speak of Anne Boleyn, no one can ignore her dreadful death. But one detail continues to chill and fascinate posterity: what happened to Anne's head after it was severed from her body. On May 19th, 1536, the skies over London were grey. In the courtyard of the Tower of London, a scaffold was raised. But unlike the usual axe execution, Henry VIII, perhaps out of a last flicker of pity, or perhaps to show his mercy, summoned an executioner from Calais, famed for using a long sword instead of an axe. With swift precision, one stroke was enough. Anne's head fell cleanly. Many witnesses said the death was so quick, so gentle. They could hardly believe it was real. Yet the tragedy did not end there. According to Tudor custom, the condemned usually had a coffin ready, their remains laid to rest with dignity. No coffin, no queen's funeral. Instead, her body and severed head were placed into a crude wooden box meant for arrows, taken from the tower's stores. A queen once seated on a throne was buried like a nameless criminal. Her remains were interred in the chapel of St. Peter Advincula within the tower grounds the resting place of many political victims of the Tudors, but her grave bore no marker, no name, just earth, cold and anonymous. Among countless others, Centurie-Lateur, in 1876, during renovations to the chapel, workers uncovered several skeletons. One, described as a petite woman in her 30s with a cleanly severed neck, was believed to be Anne, yet records were muddled, graves confused. So certainty was impossible. Historians still ask, is Anne truly buried beneath that chapel floor? Or was she laid elsewhere? A darker legend lingers. Some believe Anne's head was not buried with her body. Loyal servants may have stolen it, keeping it as a relic. Murky tales tell of the skull being hidden in a convent, later lost when Henry dissolved the monasteries. Even into the 20th century, rumours swirled of a skull found in Kent, near Hever Castle, the Boleyn family seat. Perhaps just folklore, but fitting, isn't it, for a woman branded witch? Tréteau, séductresse. Could the people resist weaving ghostly tales around her severed head? Anne's head became more than remains. It became a haunting image in English folklore. Visitors to the tower still claim to see her ghost headless, carrying her skull in her arms, gliding silently through cold corridors. Some swear they have heard whispers in the wind, a woman's prayer rising from the stone floor where she was buried. Strangely, in later art and literature, Anne is often remembered not for her smile or her eyes, but for her Fellenhit, perhaps because it was the most vivid proof of Henry's cruelty and of the injustice she suffered. Even more eerie is a folk tale on stormy nights. People said they saw a phantom coach, drawn by 4 black horses, racing through the countryside of Kent. Inces at Anne Boleyn, clad in a wedding gown, her bloody head cradled in her lap. This tale persisted in the 18th and 19th centuries, as if to say that her violent end still haunted the land. Anne's head is more than a gruesome relic. It is a metaphor for her fate. All her life, she was a woman who fought with her mind, intelligent, sharp, eloquent, persuasive, and in the end, it was her head, her wit, her voice, her will that Henry struck from her shoulders, as if he wanted to silence her forever. But history is cruelly ironic. Henry could sever Anne's head, but not her influence. That head, her intellect, her pride, her sharpness lived on in Elizabeth, and Elizabeth, with her mind, reigned for 45 years, ushering in a golden age. Today, when you step into the chapel of St. Peter Advincula at the Tower of London, you will see a small stone slab bearing Anne Boleyn's name. It is a belated acknowledgement. After centuries of silence, yet it still chills visitors under that stone. Does Anne truly rest head and body together, or is it only an empty gesture, leaving the question forever unanswered, whatever the truth? Anne Boleyn's head has become inseparable from England's historical imagination, tragic, haunting, a reminder that royal power can kill a person, but never the story they leave behind. Fact 15. The ghost of Anne Boleyn, the headless spirit of the Tower of London. If you think Anne Boleyn's tragedy ended when the cold sword struck her neck on that May morning in 1536, you are mistaken. Her story stretches beyond death itself. It lingers, night after night, in the dark corridors of the Tower of London, where her soul, it is said, has never found rest. The Tower of London has long been called the House of Royal Ghosts. From the lost princes in the tower to betrayed queens, many shadowy figures are said to haunt its walls, yet none are as chilling, or as famous, as Anne Boleyn, the headless queen. For centuries, yeomen, warders and guards have reported seeing Anne in different forms. Sometimes she walks the halls in a black velvet gown, carrying her severed head in her hands like some ghastly relic. Sometimes she kneels in St. Peter Advincula, the chapel above her grave. Eyes closed as though in prayer. At other times, she is said to appear in a phantom coach, drawn by black horses, racing across the tower bridge before vanishing into the mist. One of the earliest accounts comes from the 19th century. When a guard swore, he saw a woman step out from the shadows. Thinking it an intruder, he raised his weapon only to freeze in horror. The woman had no head. Her hands clutched the skull tightly, blood dripping onto her cloak. The guard screamed, collapsed, and was bedridden with fever for days. In the early 20th century, a chaplain at St. Peter Advincula reported another eerie encounter. While praying, he felt someone behind him. He turned nothing, but in the corner of the altar, he swore he saw a woman kneeling, her long hair flowing down, her head resting in her hands. What makes these tales frightening is not their gore, but their persistence. For 5 centuries, countless guards, clergy, and visitors have claimed to see Anne. Why her, and not others who also died here? Some spiritualists believe Anne's soul cannot move on, bound by the injustice of her death, betrayed, accused falsely, killed by the husband who once swore love such agony. They say, keeps her trapped. Each sighting of Anne is said to be history's way of reminding the living of that wrong. Historians, however, offer a different view. They say Anne's ghost is a creation of folklore. Her death was so infamous that later generations embroidered ghost stories to give it even more drama. The tower itself, dark and grim, only feeds the imagination. Thus, Anne's ghost became part of Tudor legend. Still, some details are hard to dismiss. In the 19th century, an entire troop of guards claimed to see Anne crossing the tower courtyard under the moonlight. Not one man, but many, all at once. Stranger still, they reported the air suddenly freezing, their breath misting as though in winter, though it was June. And then there is the strange consistency. Anne almost always appears without her head. Other tower spirits, such as Thomas More or the boy princes, are said to appear whole. Anne, never. Perhaps this is not just because of how she died, but because her severed head symbolizes her life. She fought with her mind. And it was her head Henry took away. Ironically, Anne's ghost is now part of Britain's tourist culture. Visitors come not only to see the crown jewels, but to hear the guides speak of the headless queen. People shiver, but they also lean closer, eager. In a way, Anne has had the last word. Henry could destroy her body, but he could not erase her memory. Some writers even joke, if you want to know whether England still remembers Anne Boleyn, try sleeping one night in the tower. She will remind you, whether the tales are real or imagined. They matter. Anne's ghost is more than a story to frighten children. It is folklore's way of retelling her injustice, again and again, ensuring it is never forgotten. A living memory, cloaked in superstition. And so, each night, in the cold mist of the Tower of London, people say Anne Boleyn still walks her head in her hands, eyes closed, silently reminding the world power can kill a body, but never the story it leaves behind. Fact 16. Elizabeth I and the shadow of her mother, Anne Boleyn. When Anne Boleyn was beheaded on that May morning in 1536, she left behind a little girl, just over 2 years old. That child, with her fiery red hair and sharp eyes, was Elizabeth the future, Queen Elizabeth I, Gloriana of England. But before she was celebrated, Elizabeth endured a childhood haunted by her mother's grim shadow. The moment Anne's head fell, Elizabeth lost everything. Her title of legitimate princess was stripped. The palace became an alien place, and the court regarded her as a bastard child. From being the daughter of a queen, she was reduced to an abandoned girl. raised by tutors and governesses, her future uncertain. Few know this detail after Anne's execution. Henry VIII ordered every trace of her erased from court, portrait removed, crests smashed. Even the intertwined H and A carved into palace walls were scraped away. And yet, at Hampton Court, one carving of H and A was cut so deeply it could not be removed. It remains, like a curse, or perhaps a testament that Anne's presence lingered no matter how Henry tried to deny it. Elizabeth grew up in that atmosphere where her mother's name was taboo, where whispers of witchcraft and adultery swirled around Anne's memory. Some even claimed Elizabeth was born of sorcery. Imagine being a child and hearing your mother called a demon. That shadow must have followed Elizabeth all her life. But instead of breaking her, Elizabeth transformed that shadow into strength. From Anne, she inherited her bright eyes, sharp mind, and mastery of words as weapons. Though often compared to her father Henry VIII, in truth, she resembled Anne far more her charisma, her daring, and her fated solitude. One courtier once wrote that when Elizabeth stood to speak, slender figure, blazing eyes, the entire room was spellbound. He thought to himself, that is Anne, alive again. That invisible inheritance sustained Elizabeth through endless trials. From her imprisonment under Mary I to her own reign over a divided kingdom. Yet Elizabeth never openly praised her mother. She rarely mentioned Anne in official documents. Perhaps the name remained too dangerous. Still, her actions whispered differently. She ensured the chapel of St. Peter ad Vincula, where Anne lay in an unmarked grave, was restored and dignified. She gave honor where her mother had been denied. One touching story tells of a special ring Elizabeth owned. Inside was a hidden locket with two tiny portraits, one of Elizabeth, one of Anne. Elizabeth kept it close all her life. A secret testimony that, whatever the world said, she had never forgotten her mother. The irony of history is sharp. Henry killed Anne because she could not give him a son. Yet the very daughter he discarded became the greatest monarch of the Tudor dynasty. Elizabeth reigned 45 years, turning England into a global power, ushering in the Elizabethan golden age of Shakespeare, exploration, and art. And in every triumph, one might imagine Anne's shadow standing quietly behind her daughter. Perhaps, if her spirit truly wanders the tower. Anne finally smiled, watching Elizabeth on the throne, a future Henry never dreamed of. One last detail adds poignancy in 1603. As Elizabeth lay dying, she refused to take to her bed. She stood for hours, eyes distant, as though gazing at someone unseen. Some said she was reaching for her mother, the woman who never saw her grown. When Elizabeth finally passed, the Tudor dynasty ended. Yet in that moment, Anne's long tragedy closed in a strange, perfect circle. Anna died in disgrace, but Elizabeth lived to restore the glory. Together, in different ways, they carved their names into history. And perhaps, in the silence of eternity, mother and daughter were reunited, not in blood or pain, but in the truth that a mother's love never disappears. Fact 17. Did Henry VIII ever regret killing Anne Boleyn? Henry VIII is one of the most famous and infamous kings of England. In his youth, he was praised as the perfect knight, defender of the Catholic faith, a man of vigor, music, and charm. But by the end of his life, Henry had become a tyrant, suspicious, brutal, trapped in a failing body and a darkened mind. And in that shadow, one question lingers. Did he ever regret killing Anne Boleyn, the woman who once drove him mad with desire, judging from his public actions after 1536? The answer seems obvious: no. He erased Anne's name from memory, swiftly married Jane Seymour just days after Anne's death, and dismissed Anne as nothing more than a stain, a witch and traitor, unworthy of remembrance. Yet history is rarely so simple. In the scattered records of Henry's final years, strange signs appear. First, at Hampton Court Palace. In certain rooms, the carved initials H and A, Henry and Anne, were once visible on the beams. After Anne's death, craftsmen were ordered to erase them. But some cuts were too deep, impossible to scrape away. Henry walked those corridors for the rest of his life. Did he see them? Perhaps each time his eyes fell upon the old carving. Memories of Anne returned in a rush. Then there was the golden bracelet, rumoured to have been a gift from Henry to Anne. It vanished from court after her execution. But years later, it surfaced again in the private royal collection. Who kept it? Who tucked it away? If Henry himself allowed it to be preserved, then perhaps deep inside, he could not quite bring himself to erase every trace. In his later years, Henry VIII suffered terribly from ulcerated legs. The wounds festered, stank, and made walking impossible. During those final painful days, courtiers recorded moments when he grew strangely quiet, his voice breaking when he spoke of the past. He often remembered Jane Seymour, the wife who died, giving him Edward. But some notes claim that, in fevered delirium, he called out Anne Boleyn's nickname. It could be invention, but if true, it was a rare glimpse of regret. For between love and hatred, Anne was the only woman for whom Henry VIII once risked everything: the church, the nation, just to have her. Some historians even suggest Henry never fully believed Anne guilty of adultery. Instead, he needed her gone to legitimize his marriage to Jane Seymour. That would mean Anne's death was not punishment for betrayal, but simply the price of Henry's ambition. And if that is true, then the weight of regret is heavier. Still, he killed the woman he once loved most, not for her sins, but for his convenience. It is also said that Henry VIII grew uneasy when speaking of souls. Toward the end, he became oddly devout, ordering constant prayer, building chapels. Was this preparation for death? Was he afraid of meeting Anne in the next world, the woman who had gone to the scaffold in injustice? There is a detail worth pondering when Elizabeth rose to the throne. She never openly condemned her father for killing her mother, but in another sense, her reign was itself a silent vindication. Henry killed Anne to have a son, but it was the daughter he discarded who brought England its greatest glory. If Henry could have seen that, would he have felt remorse? In the end, we cannot know for certain whether Henry VIII truly regretted Anne's death. He left no confession, shed no public tears. Yet the fragments, the half-erased carvings, the preserved trinkets, the fevered whispers suggest that somewhere in the iron heart of the king, regret may have smouldered. Henry's death in 1547 closed a chapter of blood and paradox, but history preserves the irony. A man who killed his queen to secure a son, only to be remembered most for the daughter she bore, Elizabeth. And so, after travelling through secrets, rumours, shocking truths, and shadows of history, we return to the figure of one woman, Anne Boleyn. She began as a minor noble's daughter, rose to a queen, became the spark of a religious revolution, and was finally destroyed by the very storm she helped create. What made Anne different was not beauty or wit alone, but the way she reflected the ambitions, désirs, and brutalities of the Tudor age. She fell not only for her own faults, but because in that ruthless game, no one was ever safe. And bitterly, the daughter Henry once dismissed, Elizabeth rose to the throne, proving that Anne had not died in vain. Such is history, cruel and magnificent, cold and unforgettable. If you close your eyes, you can still hear footsteps echoing through the Tower of London's corridors. See Anne's grey cloak on the scaffold, dissolving into dawn mist. But you can also see Elizabeth I, proud and unshaken, living proof that from ashes, roses still bloom, And now, perhaps it is time to close this heavy book of Anne Boleyn. The night is deep. The wind outside whispers old stories, drawing us into a quieter space. So let your eyes drift shut, your breath slow, your body release every thought. Picture yourself in a warm chamber, candlelight glowing soft, while the world outside turns on as always, but you are safe. And still, may you sleep deeply, beautifully. Good night. And until we meet again, on another journey, where history once more leans close to share its secrets.